Well, if you aren't saturated now, you will be by the time we finish this morning. Okay. The United States and New York City, as we said last time, come out of the First World War in a very strong position. Europe has carved itself up. The United States has got all of its industrial apparatus and financial apparatus intact. New York is now vying with London for the status of the financial and cultural capital of the world, although it hasn't pulled it off yet. This is a decade in the 1920s when American business is going to make great leaps forward, and it can do so partly because it's in a stronger position vis-a-vis European competitors, partly because business is in a stronger position vis-a-vis labor. The radical movements that had been very powerful have been basically crushed during the First World War. The socialists, admirably, but they came out on the losing side, had opposed U.S. entry into the war. And labor unions, in fact, in the 1920s are at their lowest ebb that they have been for half a century. This pushes wages down and again expands business and corporate profits. There's a worm in this apple, of course, that in fact if people don't have high wages they can't afford to buy goods, but for the time being that's not a problem because it's papered over by a tremendous expansion of the credit industry. This is in fact the era of installment buying and the availability of mass credit now for the first time. There's also, in fact, this is an era when, more on this later on, that U.S. exports begin to boom in new directions, particularly south of the border, down towards Latin America. All right, but what drives the 1920s boom is really the functioning of the New York Stock Exchange in tandem with an explosion of corporations producing commodities largely for domestic markets. The New York Stock Exchange functions also on credit. You are allowed to buy stocks on margin. All you have to do is put up 10% at your local broker, and New York now begins to throw a network of brokerage houses out across the United States, funneling investment capital from ever lower down in the strata, but still really only upper middle class people and rich people are still buying stocks. It's not yet the mass operation it's going to be, but nonetheless investment capital pours into New York, and then, as it should be in all the economics textbooks, it flows out to fertilize real investment. And there are several key commodities that we're talking about. There is the airplane and the airline industry, which had started earlier. In fact, in the early part of the century, very soon after Kitty Hawk, there were airplane races where airplanes would take off from the flat areas out in Hempstead and Garden City and do races around New York Harbor. The idea was to go and fly around the Statue of Liberty and then race back, and whoever got there first won. But now, partly aided by the development of U.S. mail contracts, the network of airplanes is expanding, and capital begins to pour into operations like Pan Am, which is also now moving down into South America, and Eastern Airlines, which are in fact expanding throughout the United States. The second big one is radios. We'll come back to radios in detail in a second, but it's a stand-in for small electrically driven consumer goods. And those electrically driven consumer goods, washing machines, refrigerators, and so forth, are now in fact reaching a much wider audience than ever before, partly because they are in fact available on credit, partly because mass production is making them cheaper. But the ultimate, of course, consumer good is the Model T Ford. And once again, it's an interlink between mass credit, mass production, and mass consumption. That triad, which is very largely being financed and also advertised, Madison Avenue explodes during this period, pushing these commodities. So, and even if you don't have them, you can buy them on credit. The automobile is itself a driver for the suburban explosion, which means that the other commodity is housing. Now again, this is a nationwide phenomenon. It's not what it's going to be after the Second World War, but we're moving in that direction. In New York City, the suburbs are Queens and Brooklyn. Brooklyn, which had expanded south and east from the industrial areas along the coast, is now moving down from the heights into the flatlands out towards Canarsie. And anybody who knows Brooklyn or Queens, for that matter, knows that suburban communities built from the 20s on have got a remarkable innovation compared to the row houses of Brooklyn and Manhattan, to wit, a garage. So these are, and many of them, in fact, are not reachable by the subway networks because they, in fact, are built after the bulk of the subway construction. Okay. At the same time, you have got a stock market boom in tandem with a consumer goods boom. You have also got a skyscraper boom. As in fact the corporations like Chrysler, automobiles, well, in fact, they begin to throw up ever grander new skyscraper towers, in this case, the Chrysler building. In fact, there's a mad frenzy, and it's almost, in fact, similar to the frenzy that's beginning to grip the stock market as the decade wears on. And in fact, the money that comes from stock market profits now pours into the real estate markets. And it drives together with new levels of technology that allow, ever faster, more rapid ability to throw these huge structures up. And you get, in fact, races now. The most dramatic race of the period is between the two contending physical areas of Manhattan. Downtown Wall Street, which had been the great center of corporate life and financial life and so forth, has been, in fact, leaking corporations up to Midtown for some time. Arguably, Wall Street peaked somewhere around 1911. There is a big surge, however, downtown in the 1920s, and the biggest of them all is the Bank of the Manhattan Company, fascinatingly the descendant of Aaron Burr's operation back in the 1790s. And they announced they're going to build the tallest building in the world at 40 Wall Street, and up they start going. Chrysler announces as the champion of Midtown, and Midtown is boomed because of the rail complexes that we got on board last time, Penn Station and Grand Central, which is now, in fact, concentrating suburban inflow, because there isn't a link yet down to Lower Manhattan. The PATH trains are about to arrive. And in fact, wealthy people who are managers and professionals increasingly are moving to the outer suburbs. They can get into Midtown. They prefer to walk to work. So in fact, now a whole raft of skyscrapers is going up, and the Chrysler building announces it's going to be the tallest building in the world. And then the Bank of Manhattan says, okay, we're going to add 20 stories. We're going to be the tallest building in the world. And then Chrysler says, we're going to be, they just do this on paper and blueprints. And then finally, the Bank of the Manhattan Company goes to some incredible height, and Chrysler says, well, all right. And they start building. And they go up and they go up. And you can see the construction crews, it's whatever it is, a mile or two apart from Midtown to Uptown. They wave to each other as they're building. And so the Bank of the Manhattan Company tops out, as we call it in the high steel trade. And clearly, we have a chagrined Midtown Chrysler building because it just, hasn't gotten it up, as it were, high enough. And then the coup. And Walter P. Chrysler, with phalanx of public relations experts, another industry that emerges powerfully in the 1920s, image management, and all of the press is in fact called in to attend to this. Turns out that on the top there, inside that stainless steel tower, they had secretly built this gigantic antenna, and now it kind of comes out like this, climbing and climbing past the Bank of the Manhattan Company, and astonishingly past the hitherto tallest structure on the face of the earth, the Eiffel Tower, to claim the new heavyweight championship of the world. But alas, they're about to lose it in virtual minutes to a contender which, as you know, lives right across the street. And Al Smith, who got creamed, as we mentioned back in the 1928 election, has gone on to bigger and better things than the presidency. Arguably, he has become the president of the Empire State Corporation, together with his rich multimillionaire friends, notably John Raskob, who was notorious in the 20s as the author of a magazine piece that says, everybody ought to be rich. which was, in fact, arguing that you should run out and invest in stocks. And all those stock investors are, in fact, providing the money which is allowing him on credit largely to throw up this gigantic building. There's beginning to be some nervousness about whether or not we can actually absorb all this office space, but, caution is thrown to the winds. And in fact, a new contender enters the list, and he's got the deepest pockets of them all, and it's John D. Rockefeller Jr. The family is, in fact, in an odd way, echoing Astor's move out of Beaver into Manhattan real estate, has moved in considerably, not all of it. The Standard Oil Corporation skyscraper goes up, and they're Wall Street aficionados down on Lower Broadway in 1926. But the Rockefeller family are moving out of oil and into banking. They're going to, in fact, be eventually the Chase Manhattan Bank people. And also, they move into Manhattan real estate. And they envision something which is going to be a combined shopping mall anchored by a cultural tenant with the Metropolitan Opera House, which is at this point still on 39th Street and Broadway, now surrounded by the garment district, which we recall kind of got shunted over there by the big department stores, and they think this is very déclassé, although in fact Italian and German working class people are the people who are filling up their gallery seats. However, they want to move to a nice uptown location. They're going to move to the new Rockefeller Center. As we will see, that doesn't work out because events intervene. And in fact, the opera company is going to be replaced by the radio company, an interesting shift from high culture to mass culture, and we're going to get the emergence of Radio City. Now, radio, I think, is a particularly fascinating story, and its relationship with New York City. And I'm going to here dip down even below crop duster level, bouncing off the ground, actually, here and there, and give you a little sneak preview excerpt from Volume 2, because I think probably nothing I can think of better illustrates the incredible interactions of different parts of New York City than radio. Unlike airplanes and automobiles, which were developed elsewhere and then sucked into the city's vortex, America's radio industry started in New York. The metropolis nurtured its technology, underwrote its manufacture, and provided its first audiences, first performers, first advertisers, first producers, and first critics. Radio emerged from a synergistic interaction between the city's cultural and educational institutions, both public and private, its entertainment venues, its organs of communication, its civic and commercial traditions. In initiating and then dominating the new industry, New York secured its inherited position as America's information and entertainment capital and extended its primacy into the 20th century. This rollover phenomenon is something that, in fact, is absolutely an amazing part of the New York story, particularly in this sphere, from the telegraph and the mass publishing press and magazine, on to vaudeville and the Broadway theater, on to the radio and the movies, and then on into television, and then a glitch emerges, but we'll come to that next time. New York's radio romance began in October 1899 when Guglielmo Marconi brought his wireless telegraph to town to report the America's Cup race, which was being held in New York Harbor. 2 steamships outfitted with his revolutionary invention tracked the yacht's progress as they sailed back and forth off Sandy Hook, transmitting dots and dashes back to shore. Marconi, with P.T. Barnum-esque flair, was testing the market waters. When eager buyers emerged, including empire-minded naval officers and merchants poised to penetrate Latin American markets, Marconi and his British associates incorporated the Marconi Wireless Company of America. The firm outfitted ships to communicate with Marconi shore stations, one of which was established at Seagate on Coney Island. Marconi's feats inspired a newly minted Yale graduate named Lee DeForest to further develop and market the new technology. DeForest was of ancient New York stock. He was a descendant of a DeForest, a French Huguenot who in 1636 had established a tobacco plantation up in Harlem. DeForest established a rival wireless company, and to tout its stock, he parked his wireless auto number 1 in front of the New York Stock Exchange and transmitted stock quotations to nearby brokers' offices. Investment money poured in to DeForest's operations. He set up now a glass-walled laboratory on the roof of 17 State Street, one of the taller new buildings. Then he borrowed borrowed in quotation marks, another inventor's device, a vacuum tube, and he improved it. The Audion, as he called it, allowed actual speech and music, not just dots and dashes, to ride piggyback on continuous waves of electromagnetic energy. It proved to be one of the key elements on which the radio, indeed the whole electronics industry, would be built. On March 28, 1906, DeForest beamed 1,000 words from his Coney Island station to Ireland. 572 were received. Another grappling hook had been thrown across the Atlantic. He now builds on the Parker Building at 4th Avenue and 19th Street, another exploratory station, and begins experimental transmissions to a growing number of amateurs with receivers tuned to the proper frequency. First, he transmitted music from records. Then he broadcast a live songster whose rendition of I Love You Truly was picked up by 2 operators at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. In 1909, DeForest put his mother-in-law on the air, Harriet Stanton Blatch, the feminist leader, who gave a talk on suffrage. In 1910, he set up his apparatus on the stage of the Metropolitan Opera House and broadcast Caruso singing arias from I Pagliacci. The tenor's tones were picked up by Connecticut hams and wireless sets at sea. I look forward to the day, DeForest said, when opera may be brought into every home. He went farther, predicting that, quote, someday the news and even advertising will be sent out over the wireless telephone. Exactly the same idea was worrying executives at the Broadway headquarters of the giant communications corporation, the American Telephone and Telegraph Company. Concerned that American Marconi might move into wireless telephony, the phone company, beginning in 1912, began buying up DeForest patent rights. Then AT&T set up the West Street Labs of its subsidiary Western Electric. On the west side is the inheritor of that building, and set its subsidiary Western Electric to refining the invention. Meanwhile, uptown, in 1912, Edwin Howard Armstrong, another New York City inventor and also scion of an old local family, took DeForest's work in a more theoretically sophisticated direction. Armstrong, a student in the electrical department of Columbia University, figured out how DeForest's Audion actually worked. This allowed him to unleash the vacuum tube's potential as an amplifier, transmitter, and receiver of radio waves. He began plucking signals out of the air from as far away as Honolulu. Not surprisingly, the next year, in 1913, a delegation of Marconi engineers came to the lab to see Armstrong's astounding invention. The team was led by Marconi executive by the name of David Sarnoff. Sarnoff was not a pedigreed New Yorker. He had been fetched to the city in 1900 from a Minsk shtetl by his house painter father at the age of 9. To help support the family, David peddled newspapers, Abe Kahn's Forward each morning, the Orthodox Tagelblatt each afternoon, and he ran a newsstand in Hell's Kitchen and delivered telegrams. Taken with telegraphy, he learned Morse code, taught himself the new electronic technology at the New York Public Library, and got a job as an office boy at the William Street offices of the Marconi Company. Sarnoff's future in the notoriously anti-Semitic communication industry seemed doubtful. Colleagues summoned him by shouting, "Jew boy!" In 1906, however, he met Marconi in town for a visit, and they hit it off. Sarnoff, Marconi said, this may be the first time this has ever been used, was, quote, on his wavelength. Sarnoff was promoted to junior wireless operator and then worked his way up the ranks and became chief operator, and it was there at the Wanamaker department store station on 9th Street and Broadway on Sunday, April 14th, 1912, that he picked up the faint signal from other Marconi transmitters relaying word that the Titanic was sinking. He parlayed this, he wasn't the only guy, but he cast himself as the sole link with the drowning liner, gave him a minor celebrity status. He now joined management and hence was the head of the team that in 1913 went up to Columbia to visit Armstrong's lab. He immediately grasped the profit potential of Armstrong's receiver. If music and entertainment could be transmitted at large, broadcast, millions might buy radio receivers as they had phonographs. A fortune awaited the first broadcaster manufacturer. American Marconi, his outfit, proved indifferent to Sarnoff's vision. They kept on with existing business, and then came the war, and the U.S. government confiscated all their ship-to-shore stations because they were under British control. And worse, at war's end, the Wilson administration was determined to break Great Britain's hammerlock on global communications. Britain had monopolized cable technology, and now, if Marconi got his way, his American subsidiary would lock up wireless as well. Accordingly, they forced them out of business and cajoled General Electric, headquartered in New York City at 120 Broadway, into setting up a new American-dominated company, the Radio Corporation of America. With help from the House of Morgan, RCA bought out American Marconi's assets and patents. Sarnoff was kept on as commercial manager. The fledgling radio industry was now securely planted in New York City. By 1921, RCA was ready to launch broadcasting big time, and he settled on a spectacular program, Sarnoff did. He would broadcast blow by blow the heavyweight championship prize fight to be held in July between Jack Dempsey and George Carpentier. In preparation, Sarnoff had radio sets and loudspeakers set up at theaters, lodge halls, ballrooms, and barns throughout the eastern United States. In Manhattan, loudspeakers were attached to the New York Times building. Roughly 300,000 people heard the broadcast, the largest audience ever assembled. Now RCA jumped in feet first. They put up two 115-foot towers atop the 21-story skyscraper Aeolian Hall just up the street, 33 West 42nd Street. And in May 1923, radio station WJZ began regular broadcasting from this Radio Central. Exactly as predicted, with the arrival of the boom of the 20s, sales of radio sets leapt phenomenally from only a few in 1921 to 100,000 in 1922 to 500,000 in 1923. And not only the affluent middle class bought them. By the late 1920s, one commission reported, quote, "On the roof of practically every tenement house on the Lower East Side, numerous radio antennae are in evidence." Just as he's getting rolling, he's blindsided by the phone company, by AT&T, which sets up a rival radio station, poetically called WEAF, for Water, Earth, Air, and Fire. It commenced service in 1922, and it announced a new plan. They were going to have something called toll broadcasting. They were going to set up a phone booth, in their metaphor, to which advertisers would come and, like put money in the slot, only money in their pocket, and then broadcast on their telephone line networks. The world's first radio commercial was a 10-minute advertisement for apartments in Jackson Heights. And in fact, again, you see all these things are tying together here, yes, the suburban business. This small little real estate company, it had a few trickles in, and then all of a sudden, whoop, they were flooded with people pouring out from Manhattan to buy places in Jackson Heights. Immediately, Tidewater Oil and American Express rented the phone booth. At Christmas, Macy's and Gimbel's signed on. By 1923, WEF was turning a profit and commercial radio had arrived. To fill stretches of unsold time, WEAF turned to Tin Pan Alley. Music publishers gladly sent song pluggers, people like Irving Berlin in the earlier days, who in fact literally would plug songs that were written in these kind of music factories. Soon performers of all kinds were flocking to this radio showcase, but savvy New York artists, though satisfied at first with free publicity, quickly grew unhappy with unpaid appearances. Musicians, singers, and speakers demanded a share of electric money. There are many, many, many wrinkles to this thing, but by 1926, a giant merger of these two rivals is arranged, and RCA announced the formation of the National Broadcasting Company. It's going to be a new rival is going to pop up with Bill Paley and CBS in short order, but basically the constellation of giant corporations and inventors and the libraries and Tin Pan Alley and the suburbs and commercial traditions and all Columbia University, all of this stuff, it's out of this mix that comes not the radio, but the radio industry and New York's cultural supremacy. Now, one of the, in fact, most dramatic new kinds of cultural products that goes out over the airwaves is jazz. A few words on that subject. Jazz is, of course, not a native New York growth. It comes out of New Orleans, and then Louisiana musicians moving up with the Great Migration carry it up to Kansas City and Chicago, and it's a southern and midwestern operation. And in fact, New York City, its cultural soil resisted this transplant for a variety of reasons we can't get into. Nevertheless, New York began the development of its own contribution to this form. And it revolved around a peculiar phenomena, the role of the piano in New York City life. We saw, in fact, mass production of pianos up in the Bronx and elsewhere. Well, for decades now, most New Yorkers, no matter how poor, sought to own a piano. The city's enormous piano industry and easy credit arrangements now in the 20s made them widely available. Pianos were central to social life. The city teemed with amateurs and sustained a large core of virtuoso professionals, and particularly professionals were in great demand in Harlem in the 1920s to play at Harlem rent parties, which was a way that strapped tenants, in fact, could pool their resources collectively to meet the rent payment. And at the peak, the zenith of this crop of professional pianists was a fellow named James P. Johnson. And again, Johnson himself is another illustration of the incredible interfertilization of life in New York City. Johnson, although he was raised in New Brunswick and Jersey City, learned music at home from his Virginia-born mother, a self-taught pianist active in the Methodist Church, decided to become a ragtime piano player. In 1908, the family moved to New York, first to San Juan Hill in the West 60s, and then 1911 up to 99th Street, and he absorbed all of the wide variety of musical offerings available in the city. He studied Beethoven, Liszt, and Bach with an Italian piano teacher. He listened to all of the piano ticklers in the bars. He roamed the wider music-drenched city, taking in New York Symphony Orchestra performances, Victor Herbert operettas, and the work of classical pianists. The mid-teens found him playing in a rowdy West Side cellar club called the Jungles Casino, whose clientele were Gullah and Geechee migrants from the sea islands of Georgia and Carolina, working as longshoremen on the nearby docks, and he devised music to accompany their frenzied dance action, which itself descended from a West African Ashanti ancestor dance. Johnson was in huge demand at rent parties, and he developed a particular style, an exhilarating stride piano style that was indigenous to New York City. And now all these things come together when this music bursts onto the wider scene in 1923, when Johnson is approached and asked to compose the score for Runnin' Wild, a new all-black revue on Broadway. Reworking the music he had composed in the Jungles Casino, Johnson came up with a torrid dance number called The Charleston. The Charleston hit Broadway audiences like a firestorm, and this New York sensation swiftly catapulted to national attention and became the signature sound and step of the 1920s. But if, in fact, there was some local talent here, in fact, most of it was imported. And musicians poured into the city during the 1920s. By decade's end, there were more black jazz artists in New York than in Chicago, New Orleans, Kansas City, and St. Louis put together. What drew them were opportunities to make money and develop their craft. Manhattan's Tin Pan Alley was the center of the nation's music industry. It was also the headquarters for the major jazz recording companies. The big companies, at first, however, like Columbia and Victor, refused to record black artists. So in 1921, Harry Pace started the Pace Phonograph Corporation to put out Black Swan discs. He advertised them in the black press as, quote, the only genuine colored record. Others are only passing for colored. For his musical factotum, Pace had the good sense to select Fletcher Henderson. And in the mid-1920s, when the white record industry was in deep trouble, it underwent a major change of heart. Radio had arrived, and the broadcasting boom had devastated the phonograph business. Columbia was virtually bankrupt. They were so desperate for a hit that they recorded Bessie Smith's Downhearted Blues, which promptly sold 780,000 copies in under 6 months, in large part because radio stations refused to touch such material. Columbia now seized on race music, and it began recording, if seriously underpaying, artists like James P. Johnson. Jazz musicians also flocked here from around the country because they found work in New York's more than 500 dance halls. Now, these were thickest on the ground and most open to black musicians up in Harlem, where a particular new dance craze called the Lindbergh Hop, named in honor of the aviator, a.k.a. the Lindy, was danced at places like the swanky Savoy Ballroom. But the big center of all of this action was in Times Square, and alas, ballrooms, restaurants, theaters, and cabarets drew the color line. So, in fact, the saviors, as it turned out, of black jazz men, proved to be white gangsters, which takes us into Prohibition. An immense subject, again, the fantasy of the West that at the same time they blocked the immigration of all these wretched, dirty people from around the world, also were going to impose proper cultural values, particularly eliminating drink, which was the roots of the bar culture that in fact seemed to nourish and sustain all these horrible inventions like, you know, socialism and crime and Tammany Hall and the rest of it. Didn't work like that. What Prohibition did in New York City was it provided the opportunity of the century for a century's worth, really, the inheritors of a century-long tradition going back to Marty Scorsese of the gangs of New York. The gangs of New York in this era were, in fact, low-life hoods who preyed on a variety of local operations. Irish gangs preyed on the West Side rail yards, and the Italians had invented mafia offshoots, which largely consisted of blackmailing reputable people like Caruso in their own community, and Jewish gangsters had largely followed suit. What is remarkable about Prohibition is that it provides an opportunity for all these groups to get together in the first great multicultural industry of New York City, the provision of booze to a extremely thirsty city, which in fact had no compunction whatsoever about violating these laws, which they all understood to be an imposition of an alien heartland culture and to be roundly disobeyed, most particularly including the mayor, Jimmy Walker, and the governor, Al Smith, who officially said he longed for the day when this law would be repealed and once again we could put our foot on the barroom stool and blow the suds off of, you know, a good brew. But in fact, most people didn't wait for that. And what you get is these low-life hoods turn into big businessmen in a nutshell, because importing massive quantities of liquor from Europe, from the Caribbean, trucking them in down from Canada, developing fleets of ships, which in fact bring them in wholesale. They park just outside the 3-mile limit off southern Long Island, and they sit there. There are lights twinkling in the evening. It was known as Rum Row. Tourist boats would take people out to sort of buzz around and watch them offloading them, putting them onto World War I Army surplus PT boat equivalents, which would then, dead of night, motor them into coves and beaches along southern Long Island, although there were occasions when, courtesy of sufficiently recompensated Coast Guardsmen, they actually offloaded on docks in Lower Manhattan or Brooklyn. The problem that you had, and again, this is a constellation of famous names, from the Irish side, Auni Madden, from the Jewish side, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, from the Italian side, Costello and Luciano. There's a vast story here about generational conflict within each of these kind of terrains. And the midwife of them all, the great Gatsby brain, Arnold Rothstein, who is in effect the banker. He had made a fortune in gambling business, and he in fact midwived much of this operation by, you didn't have a friend to chase Manhattan if you were a gangster. You went to Arnold Rothstein. Rothstein, we can't get into this, but at the same time, although most of his money was going into booze, he was also busily inventing the heroin trade, and in fact most probably died in a assassination because, in fact, he couldn't pay gambling debts, and he couldn't because all of his money had been tied up in heroin. Another story, however, for another time. The problem that you've got as business people is you get the stuff in, now you've got to get it out. And here there's two institutional inventions. One of them is the speakeasy. Many arguments over the derivation of this word. One of them is from, Irish radicals who would sit and plot in the back of a bar, and whenever some, black and tan Brit would walk in, they would say, "Speak easy," It always struck me as a little dubious, but anyway. What happens is that bars transform themselves into speakeasies, and there are thousands of them throughout the city that make some degree of pretense at hiding. So from the famous knock, 3 times and ask for Mo, to, relatively everybody knows where these places are, but the police don't know. They don't know because A, they approve, and B, they're being paid liberally to approve. But on a grander scale, not all over town, but particularly free fire zones like Harlem, much to the dismay of the respectable middle-class church-going people up in Harlem, in fact, the sky's the limit, and there are wide-open nightclubs. And these nightclubs, in fact, like the speakeasies, in order to attract patronage, and most of their liquor is, in fact, pretty horrible. And in some cases, this was overcome with violence. This guy, Arthur, what's his name, Fagelbaum, or at any rate, more popularly known as Dutch Schultz, would go around to his circuit of speakeasies and say, and he produced this pretty vile green brew, and he would, basically point his Thompson submachine gun at you and say, if you don't move this stuff, you're out of here. But Auntie Madden, on the other hand, produced in a West Side converted brewery. All the breweries went out of business. The whole brewery business collapsed overnight, like many big restaurants, like many theaters that were dependent on legal upfront sales of alcohol. But correspondingly, this underground world now expands to tremendous proportions. So if you didn't have the greatest booze, or even if you did, it was wildly expensive, what you had to offer was jazz. Gangsters loved jazz. It filled their speakeasies and nightclubs with a strident, brassy sound, creating an atmosphere of excitement that kept the customers coming. Moreover, bootleggers themselves liked jazz. It was an outlaw's kind of music. The mobsters and the musicians understood one another. They shared nocturnal habits, flashy clothes, the disapproval of the straight world. And jazzmen found gangsters the most loyal of patrons. They paid on time, they ran efficient operations, they encouraged after-hours jam sessions, and they provided the steady gigs which allowed them time to perfect their music. Now, these relationships weren't always totally happy when Duke Ellington, the classic story, who was playing at Auntie Madden's Cotton Club, decided he wanted to go down to Philadelphia because a gig opened up there and left Auntie in the lurch. Auntie sent down a word to his gangster comrade in Philly, who had done the hiring, and sent the classic message, "Be big or be dead." And Ellington and his group were dispatched on the next train back to the Cotton Club to continue their engagement. So it wasn't all peaches and cream. But to wrap this up, the fascinating last piece of all of this is that the Columbia Broadcasting System, which is trying to make its own name to break into the NBC monopoly, decides that what it's going to do is not go to the Metropolitan Opera or the New York Symphony, it's going to go to Harlem. And it begins coast-to-coast concerts, and the announcer would come on and say, "From the Cotton Club, it's Duke Ellington and his famous orchestra," and immediately the band would swing into Mood Indigo, Black and Tan Fantasy, or Ring Dem Bells. And across the country, people danced to Ellington's Cotton Club sound in their living rooms, or sat back and listened, imagining they were in glamorous, sophisticated Manhattan, mingling with gangsters and movie stars. And from Henry Ford's perspective, that was precisely the problem. And this is, we won't repeat it, the basis on which that culture war of the mid-1920s was fought out. The degree to which Ford is among many who argue that it is New York Jews and gangsters and Italians and blacks and all the rest of these horrible people who are, not only festering out there in New York, but they're spreading their cultural poison now through the airwaves, mind you. How do you stop this? Out into the heartland itself. And to that degree, these cultural and urban versus rural issues get embroiled in presidential politics. We saw this at the 1924 convention and in the 1928 convention. New York City, its culture and its economy and its politics, its crime are in fact major national issues, which is in fact what sends Al Smith to 34th Street and 5th Avenue. Okay, the 20s, the 30s, the crash. The boom-bust business, this tremendous alternation of prosperity and catastrophe, is a very complex story. Economists wrangle over this. There are many reasons why things collapsed in '29. But one of the most fundamental ones is the fact that the economy was brilliantly successful. It was too successful. It pumped out cars. It pumped out radios. It pumped out washing machines. It pumped out everything you can imagine. But by the end of the decade, sales were beginning to drop dramatically. Why? Because the market was saturated. Not that there weren't many people who didn't have and wanted radios, but the percentage of that market who could afford them, even after they had turned to credit to get them over the hump, listening to the blandishments of Madison Avenue, was beginning to peter out. And in an ironic way, the success of the business community in keeping wages at low levels contributed to the inability of people to buy the very goods that they were manufacturing. So in fact, you see this fall off in industry after industry by the end of the 20s. Does this affect the stock market? Yes, it sends it up. And this is, again, a phenomenon that happens in boom after boom after boom. The financial system, which is at the beginning working in tandem with the industrial system, like it does in the textbooks, funneling capital into production of goods, separates. And while the industrial operation begins to sag, what happens is the financial system, unleashed from that, goes into a frenzy of speculation and feeds on itself and goes up to the moon. And it is now driven fantastically by the ability to put down 10% of the purchase price of a stock. And as the stock goes up, and you're sitting there, and you're a bootblack now, we're not talking about, upper middle class people, and, look at this. This is a magic elevator. And everybody tells you, John J. Raskob, everybody ought to be rich. This is never going to stop. We have solved the problems of capitalism. You hear this repeatedly every 20 years. Those crashes about the old days, 1893, forget about it. That was then. That was history. Now it's on to the endless new economy prosperity frontier. And so, what the hell? I buy some stock, I get in, I ride up the escalator a couple of stops, I sell it off, I've doubled my money, I've tripled my money, I've 10 times my money. And this is people putting in nickels now, not, big quantities of cash. The more money that pours in, the more up it goes. Plus, the stock market is manipulated. There are things like pools, where a lot of rich guys get together, and very respectable rich guys, like Joe Kennedy in the case of the radio pool, with, in fact, help from the House of Morgan, and help, interestingly, from places like Chrysler, because as the big car companies and other corporations are beginning to see their profit margins going down on the mere sale of cars, well, why bother make so many cars if people can't buy them? And in fact, you begin to start laying people off, who then, of course, have got less money to buy cars. So that sags. Well, you've got all this money in your treasury. What do? Well, you loan it out on the stock market at 20% rate of interest to speculators. So there's billions of dollars pouring into this machine. It goes up and up and up and up, and then it crashes. Now, a story grew up that, in fact, the sky rained brokers after the crash. There were all kinds. Eddie Cantor would have all kinds of jokes about people jumping out of windows. It didn't happen. A few people did, but and there were suicides, but they tended more to be sort of, in fact, working people who had invested their life saving, and they tended to jump in front of a subway car rather than jump out of a stockbroker's window. But if it didn't happen, many people in the country thought it should have happened, because there was a frenzy of fury. Now again, overlooking their own complicity in this get-rich-quick business. This is an American phenomenon. But the blame now falls on Wall Street. And there are investigations of the investment banks, and there are investigations of the brokerage houses, and Wall Street's name is mud. New York City's name, which was muddy enough as it was, is now seriously, horrible. And yet, comes 1932, who do we elect president but Franklin Roosevelt? And what happens, again, I've said this before, I don't want to repeat too much, but in essence, what Roosevelt does is he goes down to Washington and he transplants a whole series of programs that had been developed here in New York City. Arguably, the roots, we didn't have time for this last time, but arguably much of the roots of this impetus go back to the Triangle Fire of 1911, a moment when, in a nutshell, greedy factory owners who basically locked their workers in the high story of this building down on Washington Square. A fire breaks out. They jump out the windows. 147 young Jewish and Italian girls die. This galvanizes labor reformers, galvanizes, in fact, even many wealthy people in New York City who think this is just a horrible blot on the city's escutcheon. And people like Al Smith and Robert Wagner, who had up to that point been Tammany hacks in the grand tradition of Tammany being in bed with the powerful interests, now switch because partly people like the ultimate Tammany boss, Charlie Murphy, realize that in fact there may be more of a future in playing to the outrage than there is to the conservative operations. Plus the growing socialist movement fueled by Jews, but also some now renegade Germans and Irish, is a real threat on his left. So Tammany Hall moves left, and you get the modern liberal Democratic Party is organized, basically founded at this moment. Franklin Roosevelt is the inheritor of much of this tradition and many of the programs that were worked out. He, together with Eleanor, who is in fact come out of the Settlement House movement, and the women's rights movement, together with Frances Perkins, who was there that day when the girls jumped out, and now has been a labor reformer and is now going to be a Secretary of Labor. Harry Hopkins, who came out of the social work tradition, and is now going to be in charge of a whole variety of welfare programs that the New Deal establishes. A group of intellectuals up at Columbia University come down and help design a variety of economic reform programs. This leads to an explosion the first 100 days, but then other ones in the next several years. The Wagner Act, which transforms labor relations very largely along the model that had been established in New York. The Securities and Exchange Commission, which now begins to put some limits on the investment community. And in fact, there were traditional elements of that in the history of New York City itself. Social Security, which had been pushed by socialists in New York City as part of a whole larger program of social welfare, what we would call now a social democratic vision. Unemployment insurance, the argument being now pretty widely understood, whereas in the 20s it was assumed you didn't have a job, it was your own bloody fault. There was something wrong with you, you were morally deficient, you didn't have what it took. Now that many people who had been roundly condemning all those other people, and they knew they had what it took, and yet here they were without a job, began to say, this is a structural problem, this is beyond mere morality, and it requires government intervention to, in fact, support the casualties of the private economic system. Some people in the city said that the private economic system itself was the problem and should be transformed. And, for instance, as people lost their jobs by 20-25% of the population of New York City was unemployed. And those that, in fact, continued to hold jobs found their salaries shrinking dramatically. Not everybody, not all sectors. Interestingly, radio and the mass culture industry, in fact, kept on. Also, let's remember that there were an awful lot of rich people in the 1930s who stayed rich. Some of them had gotten out in time. Some of them had so much that they could afford to sustain that lifestyle. So the 30s in New York City is an odd business. On the one hand, it's that gray, horrible vision of bread lines of people lined up outside major institutions, men overwhelmingly. Women died more proportionally of starvation than did men, because it was even more embarrassing for them to announce that, in fact, they were now dependent in this way. Until, again, the arrival of the New Deal, which makes the receipt of unemployment insurance and welfare a right, an entitlement that in fact you are entitled to because it's not your fault. It's in fact the collapse of the system. But in fact, the New Deal does a great deal more than this, a great deal more than simply cash transfer payments. It also sets up a massive program of work relief. And I want to again just read you a couple of pages about this. The New Deal does many things in New York. It builds public housing. It sets up this welfare apparatus and the rest of it. But the most spectacular thing it does is to establish something called the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. This notion that what you do is you hire the unemployed to work on publicly worthy projects, either economic or in fact social, cultural institutions, is an ancient one. It had happened in many depressions in New York. Back in 1808, you can argue that Central Park was a public works measure where thousands and thousands of people were hired in the middle of the 1857 depression and the like. But there's no question that the most spectacular one in history was the WPA. And in May 1935, New York social worker Harry Hopkins was appointed to run it. On the national level, in its 8 years of life, the WPA set 8.5 million people to work on 1.4 million individual projects. Each project had to be useful, located on public property, and sponsored by a state or municipal agency that was expected to contribute equipment, materials, and supervision. A companion agency, the Public Works Administration, the PWA, under Harold Ickes, spent $4.25 billion on another 34,000 public projects. Hopkins singled out New York City for special attention. Accepting a proposal of Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, he established a separate WPA unit for the metropolis, treating it as the 49th state. LaGuardia, moving fast, set up a mayor's committee on federal projects. It put together proposals. Moses plays an important role on this, more on him next time. In October 1935, New Yorkers were piling onto the federal payroll while other cities were still poring over application forms. By early 1936, 246,000 were at work on hundreds of white-collar and thousands of engineering projects. The New York City WPA employed more people than any private corporation in town, more people than the War Department. It was one of the biggest enterprises in the United States, a veritable army of labor, and it soon transformed the face of the city. Roughly two-thirds of WPA employees labored, along with PWA counterparts, on construction and engineering projects. With astonishing rapidity and efficiency, labor battalions helped build the Triborough Bridge, the Lincoln Tunnel, extended the West Side Highway, launched the FDR Drive, and constructed LaGuardia Airport, the single most ambitious and expensive WPA undertaking in the nation. In addition, workers repaired and painted 50 bridges, built or rehabbed 2,000 miles of streets and highways, including Queens Boulevard, Jamaica Avenue, and the Grand Concourse, removed 33 miles of trolley tracks. LaGuardia was hell on wheels and wanted buses, and built boardwalks along Coney Island and Staten Island's South Shore. At the same time, they built or fixed 68 piers, laid 48 miles of sewers, and 218 miles of water mains, erected a host of sewage treatment plants, and conducted pollution control research. WPA workers also built public amenities that allowed millions of New Yorkers access to benefits not available to them in the prosperous 1920s. The New Dealers refurbished and expanded 287 parks, including Jacob Riis and Mount Morris, and laid out 400 additional ones, including Alley Pond and Cunningham. They built 17 municipal swimming pools, Orchard Beach in the Bronx, the 20,000-seat Randall's Island Stadium, a new zoo in Central Park, and 255 playgrounds in residential neighborhoods. To enhance public health care, the WPA built Queens General Hospital, repaired Harlem Hospital, established the city's first clinic to detect and treat outpatients for venereal disease, and started 2 baby health stations in dozens of neighborhoods. To ease an education space crisis, you'll like this, classes of 40 to 50 students were common. The program renovated and built hundreds of schools and did major work on Brooklyn and then Hunter, now Lehman colleges. Other public buildings erected or improved included public libraries, covered municipal markets, courthouses, homeless shelters, armories, and 391 new firehouses and police stations. In integrated public housing campaigns, the WPA, PWA, and the New York City Housing Authority demolished thousands of slum buildings and replaced them with projects like the Williamsburg and Harlem River houses. This, of course, is going to become problematic later, but the New Deal kind of public housing is not the barracks kind of public housing that was going to be built later under a different regime. More on that later. The remaining one-third of WPA projects hired out-of-a-job, white-collar, service and professional workers, doctors, nurses, pharmacists, dentists, clerks, typists, housekeepers, orderlies, actors, musicians, and lab technicians, and proceeded to shower residents with novel services. Teachers on the WPA payroll launched adult education classes. In 1938, over 50,000 illiterates, preponderantly recent immigrants, were learning to read. They taught inmates in city jails, and they developed pre-primary schools. Jobless nurses, doctors, office workers, and dentists staffed 19 health department diagnostic and healthcare centers around the city, drove around in mobile vans giving x-ray exams that uncovered 1,000 cases of active tuberculosis, tested 50,000 for syphilis and gonorrhea, ran diphtheria immunization campaigns, offered dental clinics in schools, did medical research, ran infant care centers, pioneered in recreational therapy at Bellevue's children's section, and provided household help to the elderly and chronically ill. The project established public daycare centers, all but non-existent before the Depression, in cooperation with the Board of Education. Open from 8:30 to 5:30 to accommodate working mothers, they were geared to preschool children aged 2 to 5 and offered nutritious hot lunches and regular examinations by a registered nurse. Clerical workers organized municipal records, indexed the census, augmented library staffs in nearly every branch, and drove bookmobiles to outlying neighborhoods while lawyers provided free legal aid to poor litigants. Finally, encouraged by Eleanor Roosevelt, Hopkins gave work to thousands of unemployed artists, musicians, actors, and writers, declaring, "Hell, they've got to eat just like other people." Muralists painted frescoes in post offices. Musicians and vaudevillers gave free concerts and variety shows in city parks. The Federal Theater hired 3,000 actors, dramatists, directors, and stagehands to produce both new and classic plays that reached 30 million people, and writers produced immensely popular guidebooks like the WPA Guide to New York City, while the Federal Artist Project supported thousands, among them Stuart Davis, Bernice Abbott, and Jackson Pollock. This is the program on which the conservative movement in the 1980s declared war, and which we are in the middle of, but more on that later. Speaking of war, like the First World War, the Second World War was deeply contentious in New York City. The war, remember, starts in Europe in 1939, although there had been many antecedents to that with the, in Czechoslovakia, there had been the Spanish Civil War, there had been the Japanese incursions on the other side of the earth, and arguably it all dates back to the 1933 assumption of power by Hitler. And the city had been debating the question of whether or not the U.S. should get involved in war, and the answer was a resounding no, 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 no. And it wasn't just the city, it was the entire country. Many people in the country felt immediately after the First War and all through the 20s and the 30s that the U.S. had been snookered into getting involved in that war by a combination of British imperialists and their House of Morgan lackeys, who were only interested in protecting their loans and making money, and munitions manufacturers who in fact had made money selling supplies to the combatants. And they were never going to let it happen again. They passed a series of neutrality acts from 1935 on, and every time an issue came up, the Italian invasion of Abyssinia, the Spanish Civil War, the events in Eastern Europe, these were strengthened to insist that the United States not get involved in it, not in fact even send arms or loans to any of the combatants, because once you start down that road, you'll be inevitably be sucked in. By 1939, things were looking a lot grimmer because, in fact, this was clearly had the potential to totally transform the map of the world. Nonetheless, and the heartland centered in Chicago were most vociferously insistent. No, even with Hitler, we still don't want to get involved in this operation. And many people said, what's to choose between German imperialism and British imperialism? And that argument struck home in New York City as well. Needless to say, the German community had no interest in fighting Germany. Many of them were ambivalent about the Hitler regime, ambivalent about anti-Semitism, partly because they lived in a society in which 2 million of the population were Jews and were in a position to retaliate, unlike, in fact, the Jews who were very clearly getting in increasing trouble inside Germany itself. The Italians hailed Mussolini's expansion, hailed the movement into Africa, and in fact there were tremendous battles, some of them cultural, as in the Joe Louis Primo Carnera fight in 1935. Others of them fought out on the streets of East Harlem, which is in fact Italian and perfectly adjacent to Central Harlem, which is black, and they're bitterly fighting on the street over foreign policy issues. There are many people in the city who don't want to get involved in this. The people who increasingly do want to get involved in this are, again, the same people who pushed for the First World War, the largely Anglo banking community, and the Irish, of course. The Irish are most vociferously opposed to getting into the war, probably of any of them, because they see, and they have since the Spanish Civil War, that in fact Catholicism is being attacked, and that in fact, although they begin to get more ambivalent about this when they see how it plays out in Germany, they think that in fact the real enemy is godless communism. And so why are we getting in bed with Stalin? That's entirely the wrong direction. And in fact, many of them drawn to a form of street-level fascism, the Christian Front, and in fact in Washington Heights and other contested zones, there are street of fascism become stronger, and popular opinion, largely aided by New Yorkers, the mass media here, people like Henry Luce, who runs the Time Life Empire, the Reeds, who run the Herald Tribune. These people are instrumental in fact, through their newsreels that are playing movie theaters all around the town, in fact, promoting what Roosevelt is pushing for, at the very least aid to Britain to allow it to withstand being overrun, thus allowing the Germans to seize all of Europe, and if they drove east, the breadbasket of the Ukraine, to be an autonomous, massive rival to the entire United States position on the planet, and maybe even outflank them because they had sympathizers in South America, and move that way, and in fact encircle the United States in league with their their allies, the fascists who have come to power in Germany. The war comes, and then it's a moot point. We're in, and New York is in fact the day after Pearl Harbor. All the alarms ring in New York. We don't have alarms, actually. They had to use police sirens and fire station sirens. The first massive air raid alert, they were convinced that waves of German planes were striking any minute now. They weren't, it was a false alarm, but in fact the real menace arrived, and it arrived by sea. Days after Hitler foolishly declares war on the U.S., the German U-boats are unleashed, and the first one arrives, U-boat 1, 2, 3, under the command of Captain Reinhard Hartigan, and he runs along the southern shore of Long Island. He surfaces, torpedoes a Norwegian freighter, and then creeps right to the edge of the harbor. He would actually go in, but he's sure that the U.S. Navy must have this place mined and defended much better than in fact it actually did. So instead he submerges and he waits, and that evening his crew surf the radio dial, and they listen to the Molly Goldberg show, and the Mrs. Goes a-shopping, and the Gramercy Park Chamber Orchestra, and then he kind of surfaces in the dead of night. And to his amazement, he's just off Coney Island, the Ferris wheel is going around, and the whole place is lit up like a gigantic Christmas tree. All the lights are on, and Times Square and the big spectaculars are gleaming in the night, and this is the first German military man to look on the U.S. directly in wartime, and he writes in his diary, my God, thinking about the German blacked out countryside, don't they know there's a war on? Well, in fact, they did, and very soon they would be right smack in the middle of it. Again, this is an immense story. We can't deal with this. Several points. One, the city reverts to its oldest and most basic form of activity, the port, and it becomes the major port of embarkation. All the troops, 3 million of them, who in fact are dispatched to the European frontier, North Africa and the rest, and then D-Day, come through the port. The U.S. Merchant Marine is in fact the people who had tremendous loss of life to U-boats out in the North Atlantic. Ferry these operations. The New York tugboats that are not only pulling things around the Navy virtually operated harbor, tugboats actually go and assist in the invasion of D-Day. The Brooklyn Army Terminal becomes the biggest warehouse in the world, one of those legacies of the great industrialization commercial movement on the Brooklyn shoreline back in the previous period, is now where the planes and the landing boats and the tanks and the munitions and all of that are, not the munitions, they're stored elsewhere, are in fact stored and off-transported into massive convoys that form up in the Hudson River. The whole Hudson, way up even north of the city, are surrounded by battleships. All these they move out into the North Atlantic. And other convoys come up from Cuba, which is the rendezvous point for all the traffic from the southern cone, then up to New York, and then across the North Atlantic to supply oil, which is in fact the indispensable fuel that drives the war effort. Stalin at one point at a meeting with Churchill and Roosevelt offers a toast to the American oil industry, without whom in fact the war could not have continued. The city also becomes a manufacturing mainstay, but that's a much slower state of affairs because at the beginning most of the defense contracts go to the big corporations, as we've said before, out in the Midwest, or they bankroll at government expense new plants and equipment, shipyards out in the West and out in the South. But in fact, we have the Navy Yard, where once it's up and running, 70,000 people are working in 3 8-hour shifts around the clock, including, again, most famously, critical numbers of women who are also, in fact, moving into the workforce in a variety of other areas. It is also many companies that are like, the Hamilton Radio Company now switches over to producing vacuum tubes for electronic equipment. We are involved in the production of, this is where most of the penicillin is produced at the Pfizer plant in Brooklyn. Once again, it's not single giant operations, although we are actually producing airplanes. Not here, and this is important for what's coming next, but out on Long Island and across in New Jersey, out on Long Island, the Republic and the Grumman plants, vast amounts of federal money go into expanding these things to gigantic complexes, producing P-39 or whatever they are, Thunderbolts. And of course, it is also a time of massive research and development. We have an important finger in the production of radar, but the most spectacular one of them all, needless to say, is the movement fertilized by the arrival of new immigrants like Enrico Fermi and Leo Szilard, together with physicists up in the same Pupian Hall where Armstrong had been doing his radio work not long before, where some of the critical initial steps are taken in the development of the atomic bomb. And when the Army Corps of Engineers sets up this fictive, secretive operation to run the thing, they carry over the name and they call it the Manhattan Engineering District, and not altogether inappropriately, particularly given New York's role in having those emigre physicists contact Franklin Roosevelt through the intermediary of another emigre who is a banker at Goldman Sachs, who's a friend of Roosevelt, who in fact takes this message to him that the Germans seem to be working on the possibility of an atomic bomb, and very cleverly, in a long appeal for New York City people, he reminds Roosevelt that in fact Robert Fulton had once upon a time gone to Napoleon and offered to build him a steam vessel which in fact could blow up the British fleet, and he dismissed him. an argument perfectly calibrated to appeal to a Hudson River lord with a deep sense of New York history. Two last points. The cultural impact of the war in the city, and of course the country, was spectacular in a variety of areas, but it was particularly crucial, I think, because this was the moment when the fabled Black-Jewish alliance is constructed. Two components. One, before the war actually, we get into the war in 1941, as the defense program has started up, but blacks are not being hired for it. A. Philip Randolph, the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, assisted on the margin by a young man named Bayard Rustin, whom we'll meet again, calls for a march on Washington of 100,000 African Americans from around the country, demanding that blacks be allowed to work in the defense plants and, for that matter, to, in fact, enter a desegregated army. Horrified by the potential embarrassment of this, although he resists till the last second, he sends Eleanor and Frank and Fiorello to try to argue the New Yorkers, because they're all New Yorkers, the head of the NAACP, the Union League, and Randolph. He, in fact, tries to, argue them out of this. Randolph hangs tough. He says, "We'll be there." Whether or not he could have pulled it off, nobody knows. But he stuck to it. He went eyeball to eyeball, and Roosevelt blinked. And he passed the FEPC, the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which in fact mandated, didn't actually pull off quite so much, but it was the first major federal intervention in ending discriminatory access to jobs since Reconstruction, and was arguably the beginning of the modern era civil rights movement. On the other side, Jews were desperate to get the federal government, the rest of the country, to relax the immigration restrictions which had been imposed back in the 1920s and which now were locking in their co-religionists into the death camps. And they failed miserably. And it became clear to them that, in fact, they had, while they were important players in New York City, they were powerless on the national arena. And they began to look for allies at the same time that blacks were looking for allies in their campaign. And they struck up a deal which was going to be concretized in the passage in New York State of the first state law against discrimination in 1945, which is going to be partly responsible for sending Jackie Robinson to the Dodgers. We'll stop there, although I should just note that the plans for the post-war global order, which are hatched in New York City, they begin that planning process at operations like the Council on Foreign Relations before the war even starts. Once it's clear that there's this new global affairs order emerging, they call for the construction of a new global empire of a new kind, a free trade empire, which is going to have as its basis institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the United Nations. How, in fact, that order is constructed and how it plays out, and life at what now is going to emerge at the end of the war as the center of the world, i.e. New York City, will be the subject of our last and final conclave. See you tomorrow.